In the latest and perhaps most egregious of Trump's many attempts to silence his critics, including entire news organizations, ABC News has reached a settlement with Trump over defamation allegations and agreed to pay $15 million directly to a Trump presidential library and museum, which currently only exists online. But I guess at some point in the future it will take a physical form, though I shudder to think of the titles that will be allowed in a Trump library, given his track record with books and universities. The settlement is sounding alarm bells for First Amendment lawyers and activists while being celebrated by Trump and his allies. We'll get into the details of the story and also discuss what this settlement means, alongside other recent instances of media personalities and institutions being willing to bend to Trump and kiss the ring, for the future of freedom of the press under a second Trump presidency. Let's get into it. Clearly, there's a lot of focus and scrutiny on major news media outlets lately, and that will only continue to intensify under a Trump presidency. So understanding the bias and the background info on your news sources is helpful to make sure you're getting the whole picture on the news you're reading. That's true even for the story we're discussing today about freedom of the press. Let's look at how the media is reporting on a story about the media. This recent report from Mother Jones has the headline, "Why the ABC News Settlement with Trump is Complicated." Using the Ground News browser extension, it's interesting to see that this news source has a left-leaning bias. I really love the Ground News web browser extension because I can see it while I browse news articles, and if I want to see how other sources are framing the story, I can click full coverage. On the Ground News website, you can see that there are 558 sources covering this topic. Among them, the left-leaning Mediate uses the headline, "Breaking: ABC News and George Stephanopoulos forced to apologize to Trump, shell out $15 million in defamation suit." While the right-leaning Real Clear Politics frames it as Trump's $15 million victory against left's propaganda factory. Very different takes, and if you're only reading content that skews left or right, you may not know how the other side is interpreting the situation. This is where Ground News comes in and why I've been using them for over a year. Today's partner, Ground News, is an app and website that offers tools to help you critically analyze the news you read, providing context to understand the full picture. If you scroll down on the Ground News website, you can see the overall factuality rating of the sources. 71% of these sources score high factuality ratings, so you can tell which sources you can trust. You can also see more information about who owns which source. Only 9% of sources are independent news, with 52% of sources coming from large media conglomerates. Knowing this information can help uncover any potential conflicts of interest in the stories and who's covering them. These features are incredibly valuable for anyone looking to build media literacy and recognize bias in their news consumption. By using Ground News, I feel better equipped to make sense of what's happening in the world without being influenced by just one perspective. I'm always really impressed with Ground News and genuinely think that they're a great resource. And if you want to stay more informed on US politics, you can subscribe or gift a Ground News subscription to your friends or family for the holidays. Scan my QR code, click the link in the description, or go to ground.news/Leeja to get 50% off the same Vantage plan I use, which comes to about $5 a month. Subscribing supports my channel and an independent team working to help keep media transparent. Thanks, Ground News. Back in March of this year, ABC News anchor George Stephanopoulos sat down with South Carolina Representative Nancy Mace for an interview on ABC's Sunday morning show This Week. During that interview, Stephanopoulos asked Mace, a survivor of why she endorses Trump, saying, "Judges and 2 separate juries have found him liable for rape." He was referring to the cases brought against Trump by E. Jean Carroll, in which the jury held Trump liable for sexually abusing and defaming Carroll. And the technicalities of this case matter. The case was brought in New York. The New York state definition of rape at the time the case was brought was very limited. Nothing other than vaginal penetration by a penis counted. In January this year, a new law was passed that expanded the definition because of the flaws exposed during this E. Jean Carroll trial. Because Carroll's lawyers didn't prove it happened under New York's previously very strict definition, the jury did not find that Trump had raped Carroll, but they did find he had sexually abused her and then defamed her. Ever since this case, Trump has been dead set on creating a Grand Canyon-sized chasm between the definitions of sexual abuse and rape, frequently harping on the idea that the jury found him liable for the former and not the latter. When Trump's attorneys sought a new trial, claiming that the $5 million damages against him were excessive, the judge on the case, Judge Lewis Kaplan, clarified in a ruling, which I am going to paraphrase because I'm trying to not get completely demonetized on this video. He said that just because Trump's actions didn't fit the narrow definition under the New York Penal Code for the R word doesn't mean that Carroll failed to prove he did so based on the common understanding of the R word. forward. So like, it's a legal technicality, but doesn't have any real world application. And I love that the judge pointed that out because there are so many legal technicalities without real world application, and it's rare for a jurist to be so fucking for real with us about it. And now that the New York law has been updated, if we want to get technical, he did technically do it, even under the law. But alas, we have rules against retroactive applications of laws because that would get messy, so the jury found what it found. But there is judicial opinion in the case saying basically, technically he didn't, but yes he did. Or at the very least, one could argue he did under the common understanding of the word. Okay, this is all important background, I promise. So as part of Trump's constant effort to put as much distance between himself and any sort of idea that he's a rapist, he took great issue with George Stephanopoulos' characterization in that Nancy Mace interview. So much issue, in fact, that he decided to sue for defamation. And listen, as much as we can criticize the guy, it is fully within his right to bring defamation lawsuits against people who say false and defamatory things about him, just like it's within all of our rights to do so as well. It's too expensive and inaccessible for most of us, but it's an important carve-out of First Amendment protections that are meant to allow for redress in order to protect your good name and reputation. The problem with this story is, yes, Trump's litigiousness, especially towards the media, is concerning, but how ABC responded to it is concerning as well and sets a dangerous precedent. As is standard procedure, ABC's lawyers filed a motion to dismiss the case for Trump's failure to state a plausible claim, arguing that Stephanopoulos' statements were substantially true. There's a legal doctrine, the substantial truth doctrine, wherein a statement in a defamation case doesn't have to be perfectly accurate if the gist or the sting of the statement is true. Unfortunately, at the motion to dismiss stage, the judge is only going to dismiss the case under very narrow circumstances, where, for example, as a matter of law, the judge can say there's no factual dispute or no jury would reasonably come out a different way. The judge in this case determined that a jury could reasonably find that it was not substantially true, that Stephanopoulos' statements were defamatory, so the case must move forward. And this is pretty standard, and First Amendment media attorneys who were interviewed by CNN confirmed that typically a case like this would continue to summary judgment, which is when the parties can put up a final challenge to the legal sufficiency of a plaintiff's claim before trial. Summary judgment happens after discovery, after all the evidence has been gathered and shared between the parties, after all the depositions have been taken, basically after all the dirty laundry has been aired, which typically, except for special circumstances, happens pretty publicly. The filings are public, the deposition transcripts are public, but given that this case did present a genuine question that was arguable either way, ABC lawyers could very well have continued down the path of arguing that what Stephanopoulos said was substantially true, that there was enough context for the viewers to understand what he was saying, and that therefore there was no defamation, because if a defamatory statement is true, then the plaintiff, Trump in this case, doesn't have a case at all. Instead, ABC decided to stop after their motion to dismiss was denied and move towards a settlement agreement instead. According to CNN, a number of First Amendment attorneys have weighed in as to why they think ABC chose to settle, with some saying it was just the cost of doing business, sometimes you have to settle lawsuits, and others saying they did so to avoid the discovery phase, to avoid airing out their dirty laundry. We can only speculate as to what kind of dirty laundry they would have had to air. Questions remain as to why ABC didn't issue a more immediate correction or retraction. Under Florida law, which is where the case was brought since Florida is Trump's place of residence, a news outlet can issue a full and fair correction, apology, or retraction within 10 days of receiving notice of a pending defamation lawsuit. And if they do issue that correction, then the plaintiff can only recover actual damages, that is, actual monetary loss they can prove they sustained, making the case less likely to move forward given the limited damages outcome potential. The overall concern, though, is that ABC's willingness to settle so early in the game, to barely even put up a fight, which, yes, may have cost them more than the $15 million settlement because lawyers and lawsuits are expensive, but it was a fight they could have potentially won, is a huge win for Trump and an indication of what's to come for news media outlets who slip up on a technicality when Trump has hawk lawyers just waiting in the wings to beat down any journalist or media outlet with defamation lawsuits. This will create a chilling effect as it puts journalists and even news commentators like myself, who are small independent creators that couldn't withstand the cost of a major lawsuit, it puts us all on notice that his lawyers are watching and they're willing to file lawsuits even for slight misstatements. Are Trump and his lawyers watching or listening to Why America with Leeja Miller? No, probably not. But I'm certain they wouldn't be above using some small independent creator to make an example out of for all the rest of us. And for the larger media outlets, that means editors are going to be stingier, legal departments are going to be more hawkish, there will be fear anytime anyone is writing or saying anything about Trump. And given that he will soon be the president of the United States, that is a very concerning thing. In fact, given that we are a country obsessed with First Amendment freedoms and defamation defamation lawsuits directly infringe on someone's freedom to say whatever the hell they want, there is a specific carve-out within defamation law, specifically because we are so concerned with protecting people's right to free speech, especially when it comes to our elected officials. In ruling on cases involving free speech and defamation, courts have created specific tests and protections when the person bringing the defamation claim, so Trump in this case, is a public figure. Nowadays, the definition of public figure is constantly growing and changing because everyone is internet famous, and what does it really mean to be a public figure anymore? But originally, the carve-out was especially concerned with protecting people's ability to speak out against and criticize their elected officials. So in cases where an elected official brings a lawsuit against someone for saying something defamatory, they have to prove not only that the statement was false, but also that the person who made the statement made it with actual malice, that they made the statement either knowing it was false or having a reckless disregard as to whether or not it was true. They simply didn't care about the truth. Basically, it can't have been an honest mistake, and the burden is on the plaintiff, the elected official, to prove that it was made with actual malice. And this raises the bar for a public official to bring a defamation lawsuit because, according to the Supreme Court's 1964 ruling in New York Times versus Sullivan, we have a profound national commitment to the principle that debate on public issues should be uninhibited, robust, and wide open, and that it may well include vehement, caustic, and sometimes unpleasantly sharp attacks on government and public officials. The court goes on to show the numerous times other courts have found that erroneous statement is inevitable in free debate, and that it must be protected if the freedoms of expression are to have the breathing space they need to survive. The court acknowledges that for our freedom of expression to survive, there must be an allowance for erroneous statements during free and open debate about elected officials. Basically, we should all be allowed to speak openly about our elected officials without fear that any slip-up could lead to a powerful person bringing a major lawsuit against us. Democracy requires this. ABC's settlement with Trump does the opposite. It reinforces the power of Trump's litigiousness, his willingness to sue anyone at any time for anything as a form of punishment, and when that litigiousness is directed at the news media, it becomes incredibly insidious. As the court does in New York Times versus Sullivan, this also has to be put up against the backdrop of the incredible amount of immunity public officials enjoy as part of their jobs. Our elected representatives and senators in Congress cannot be held liable for things they say on the floor of Congress. That's in the Constitution, my dude. Article 1, Section 6, speech or debate clause, look it up. But now that the Supreme Court has this past session given sweeping immunity to U.S. presidents, especially, turning them into tiny little kings that can break the law with impunity so long as they can tie it to their official acts as president, this balancing act is even more important than ever. If legislators can say whatever they want on the floor of Congress, and the president can say whatever he wants or really do literally anything at all without one single care in the world for laws or rights or regulations so long as it's part of his official duties, then surely the protections we, the people, must enjoy under the First Amendment to have open and honest debate, to openly criticize our elected officials, must be strong. If I, as an individual, cannot bring a lawsuit against an elected official or Donald Trump for defaming me if they do so on the floor of Congress or as part of their official duties, then in order to curtail the tremendous power of our elected officials, and the president especially, who in theory isn't supposed to be a little king at all, I also must be protected from defamation lawsuits even when I make an error. And it's very possible that, had ABC's lawyers decided to bring the lawsuit to the summary judgment stage or even to trial, that they could have made such an argument. They could have created new precedent for free speech protections in the face of a monarchical president. But in settling, they capitulated to Trump and set an example for the rest of us of what's to come. In fact, this lawsuit against ABC is just one of many. A number of defamation lawsuit threats have been sent to numerous news outlets, especially in the wake of Donald Trump's appointment announcements, as criticism has flooded in because it's literally a parade of incompetence and deplorables. And this is part of a larger concerning trend among the news media to bend the knee and kiss the ring in anticipation of Trump's second term. Joe and Mika from MSNBC's Morning Joe caused serious backlash when they revealed they went to have a nice sit-down discussion with Trump at Mar-a-Lago in order to restart communications between the show and Trump, despite being vocal Trump critics for years. They claimed he was upbeat and interested in finding common ground with Democrats. Their reasoning for the meeting was in part because they believe that in order for this presidency to be constructive, it will take a new new approach from all sides. This assumes very generously that a new, more conciliatory approach will be taken by the right at all, something that seems incredibly unlikely given the promises made by Project 2025 and the many lunatics Trump has stocked his cabinet and future White House with. I also would love to see footage of any Fox News host prostrating themselves before Biden after the 2020 election to try to make progress and find common ground. Trump and his allies' actions and alleged plans just for how they'll be dealing with the media alone make it apparent that Trump is not the president that is going to be bringing the parties together. According to reporting from the New York Times, Trump and his allies have discussed subpoenaing news organizations, prosecuting journalists and their sources, revoking networks' broadcast licenses, and eliminating funding for public radio and television. In fact, a bill that was meant to help protect journalists from the incoming president just failed to pass a Senate vote. The Press Act would create a federal law that would shield journalists from being forced to reveal their confidential sources. It's a law meant to protect against any attempt by Trump, his allies, and his lawyers to suss out who is speaking to the media, literally cutting off the info leaks from the source. This would, again, create a chilling effect if people who speak on the condition of anonymity to reporters, something that's long been protected as essential for journalists to perform their watchdog duties, and would discourage anyone from even doing that if they're potentially at risk of being discovered and legally punished for their communications. Again, the chilling effect on free press and on speech is apparently the entire point of Trump's actions and threats here. The Washington Post also reported that the Biden administration revised Justice Department guidelines to limit the use of subpoena power to compel journalists to participate in legal proceedings, something that Trump's administration could undo, further eroding the protections provided to journalists and further chilling their ability to freely report on the news while protecting themselves and their sources. According to the Washington Post, Senator Tom Cotton, who voted against the Press Act, called it a threat to national security and the biggest giveaway to the liberal press in American history. And Senator Cotton's criticisms reveal the principal arguments behind conservatives' push for clamping down on the press: national security and liberal media bias. According to the ACLU, the rise of the national security state and the proliferation of new surveillance technologies have created new challenges to media freedom. The government has launched an unprecedented crackdown on whistleblowers, targeting journalists in order to find their sources. Whistleblowers face prosecution under the World War I-era Espionage Act for leaks to the press in the public interest. And in the face of a growing surveillance apparatus, journalists must go to new lengths to protect sources and, by extension, the public's right to know. And this is before a second Trump term. National security has historically been a very powerful argument for justifying all sorts of atrocities, including, for example, throwing Japanese Americans into internment camps during World War II. To see it resurrected to justify censoring and fear-mongering the news media is scary because of how powerfully persuasive much of the public and the legal establishment find national security to be, even in the face of curbing long-held freedoms. However, according to Pew Research, a large majority of Americans see the freedom of the press as highly important to the well-being of society. According to a 2024 survey conducted by Pew, 73% of respondents say freedom of the press is extremely or very important, and only 8% say it is a little or not at all important. And I would love to have a chat with that 8%, because literally what? It is well established and commonly understood that a free press is essential to ensure that the government answers to the people. It is inherently tied to government accountability. It's not in the Constitution as part of the checks and balances within government, but it has long been a strong check and balance coming from outside the government. According to the ACLU, the freedom of the press, protected by the First Amendment, is critical to a democracy in which the government is accountable to the people. A free media functions as a watchdog that can investigate and report on government wrongdoing. It is also a vibrant marketplace of ideas, a vehicle for ordinary citizens to express themselves and gain exposure to a wide range of information and opinions. This is, of course, an ideal, and most things don't live up to the ideal, but the erosion of what has historically been a pretty robust free press has gained momentum over the last few decades. Large media conglomerates now control much of the media landscape. ABC is owned by Disney, for Christ's sake. And at the tippity top sit billionaires who have a direct stake in how our government runs. And I mean literally a direct stake. These billionaires have invested millions into our politicians and into lobbyists to kill or support key measures that ultimately serve the personal interests of the billionaires, not the people. This was put on stark display when the Washington Post, owned by billionaire Jeff Bezos, refused to endorse Kamala Harris ahead of this election. When billionaires who already control our government and elected officials also then control the media, whose job is supposed to be as watchdog of government, you have a runaway train that is completely unanswerable to the people from all angles, and Trump and his allies know that. In his book On Tyranny, Timothy Snyder lists the first lesson on tyranny is not to obey in advance. In a recent video, he reiterated the importance of not obeying in advance, saying that when you make concessions for a tyrant before he comes to power, you're preparing yourself for making more concessions after he comes to power. He emphasized that when wealthy and powerful people like Jeff Bezos obey in advance, it puts the onus on us, everyday people, to be braver and stronger than people with the most power who will be fine regardless of the outcome.
What it really means is that they think, I'm going to be fine. When democracy dies in darkness, I'm going to enjoy the shadows.
Because ultimately, it is us who fare worse when freedom of the press is curbed. ABC had the $15 million to spare. George Stephanopoulos still has a job. The Washington Post continues to have regular readers, frankly myself included, despite Bezos' decision to obey in advance. But as our ability to put the government on notice, to act as watchdogs through being witness to the work of journalists, becomes more limited because the journalists who don't obey in advance are out of work or otherwise silenced, because editors and higher-ups get scared of potential litigation, because Republicans are hell-bent on shutting down the free press over fears of liberal bias, like they would rather shut down all talking points than allow press freedom that may skew liberal, because they can fall back on the persuasive power of national security to get at confidential sources and subpoena journalists, because the President of the United States has free reign and will use it to sue his critics in the news media into oblivion. We are the ones who suffer in this, whose rights are eroded, because politicians and the billionaires who own them are able to operate in the shadows outside the ever-meddling gaze of journalists. Imagine what Nixon could have done if journalists with their confidential informants hadn't broke the Watergate scandal. With a fascist, power-hungry president in the White House, we need journalists and freedom of the press more than ever. And the importance of that freedom is clear in the ferocity with which Trump and his allies are fighting to shut it down, to take it from us. Don't comply in advance. What this means for you, call your senators and voice your support for the Press Act. It's not dead yet. Continue to speak out against injustices you see, especially in the government. Share them on social media, create your own posts, subscribe to news organizations you care about and want to support, follow journalists on social media and support their independent work. A lot of them have Substack newsletters. Nationally, we need greater protections for journalists and free press, but on a big picture level, we need to enforce the antitrust laws already on the books, and we need to get money out of politics. Frankly, that's going to be nearly impossible on the national level for the next 4 years, but so much of this work starts and grows in the states. Look into your state's antitrust laws and what your attorney general or other state agencies are doing to break up monopolies in media and elsewhere. What types of laws does your state have on the books to prevent moneyed interests from influencing state elections? Are there organizations or groups already pushing for these changes in your state? Or is there a chapter of a larger group you can start to push for state changes? In doing research for this video, I found that freespeechforpeople.org does a lot of this work, including at the state level, so you could go there to learn more and take action today. And if you're interested in working with me directly, learning more about eating the rich and building solidarity, I invite you to join me over on Patreon, where I'm launching the Why America Co-Learning Lab on January 1st. Get self-paced syllabi curated by me, plus guided discussions and tangible action items for building solidarity and taking political action in this new Gilded Age. Plus, you get ad-free and uncensored versions of these videos as well. Go to patreon.com/Leeja Miller to join. Thank you to my multi-platinum patrons, Con Coniger, Art, David, RH, T, Latranger Lucas, Joshua Cole, Thomas Johnson, and Tay. Your generosity makes this channel what it is, so thank you. If you like this episode, you'll like the one I made last week answering the question, is it okay to laugh at the death of a CEO? Thanks so much for watching. Have a good day. Bye-bye!